unless she held on to this sense of the divine image and likeness within herself, the divine beauty, the sense of kindness and the capacity to love and care and give and listen to other people, the sense of a centered person, unless she held on to her own center, her own what was deepest and best in her, she would be destroyed. She'd become inhuman. She would become barbaric herself. She would start hating. She would fight over scraps of food. She would attack other people. She would become she'd become kind of destroyed. So God was what enabled her to retain her humanity. God was the name of her humanity. He was what was deepest and best in her. So she had to look after this God. And it's a beautifully feminine, almost many would say, kind of a bit like the Virgin Mary, holding inside her this God that is what is deepest and best, and enabled her life to go on being beautiful.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Free Radical podcast. Today, I'm sitting at the table with a recently discovered friend, an elder, author, and Christian priest, Patrick Woodhouse. Patrick Woodhouse is an Anglican priest and a former Canon of Wells Cathedral in Somerset, England. He's the author of Etty Hillesum, A Life Transformed, and Life in the Psalms, Contemporary Meaning in Ancient Texts, both published by Bloomsbury. He lives with his wife Sam in Wales. They have 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. So we had a beautiful gathering with Patrick today. Though he spoke and he speaks and writes about many topics, he's most well known by his focus and studies on Etty Hillesum. So I've recently read his book on her, A Life Transformed. So we'll be mostly exploring the transformed and transforming life of Etty Hillesum, exploring topics like suffering and hope and praise and celebration in the midst of loss and tragedy, how to discover faith even while not being affiliated with any particular religion, as it was her case in one sense, the power of prayer, the power of being able to confront whatever makes us suffering or whatever is even threatening our own lives with compassion and wisdom, many necessary themes for the times we are living. So please stay with us, the Free Radical podcast, and to support the podcast and our project, please subscribe to our channel by clicking on the bell, and if you feel nourished by the exchange, feel free to share it, to like it, to drop your thoughts and comments so we can keep this conversation ongoing. Without much further ado, dear friends, here is Patrick Woodhouse. Dear Patrick, welcome to the Free Radical podcast. Thank you so much for coming.
Good to see you.
It's my pleasure after a few months of having met you in person. So glad to have you in conversation. And generally, I like to begin our episodes by reminding myself and reminding our audience how generally I came to know for the first time each one of my guests. And if you correct me if I'm wrong, but if in our case, I think I was introduced to you by Manjuali, that you know her as Mary,
Yes.
last year when I was in the UK. And you and your wife Sam guided us to a beautiful tour, really a pilgrimage, I will say, through Wells Cathedral, beautiful place. And then you even received us at your home, where you share some of your life story, including a good number of years spent in India, becoming familiar with its culture and spirituality. So many things to talk about. But also I remember during those days, Mary Manjuali had a copy of your book that I have it here with me, Etty Hillesum, A Life Transformed, which I basically devoured during my stay at Glastonbury, to be honest. I had already heard about Etty Hillesum's life briefly especially through my friend and mentor. You know him, Father Richard Rohr, who happens to be having his birthday today as we are recording this podcast on March 20th, interestingly. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So anyhow, in Glastonbury, not only I did read your book that deeply touched me, but also, I met the person behind the book, both Etty and you. And then I almost immediately after meeting you and Etty more in depth, I wrote to you, let's have a conversation. And I like to hear not only about Etty Hillesum, but about your own insights about her life and contribution that you share very generously in your book, Life Transforms. So I'm thinking, Patrick, to begin with, maybe for those who are not yet familiar with the unique figure of Etty Hillesum, if you can please introduce us in a general way to who she was, so we can then explore together more in detail some of the fascinating aspects of her life's journey.
Yes, well, thank you, Swami. Etty Hillesum was a young woman in Holland who kept a diary in the early years of the war, between 1941 and 1943, and also wrote letters from the transit camp where all the Dutch Jews were sent. She was, how shall I put it, a chaotic, emotionally confused, insecure, rather muddled up young woman, highly intelligent. She came from a mixed family. Her father was Dutch, her mother was Russian. They were very ill-suited to one another. He was an academic recluse, a very withdrawn man, who loved books, but would tend to retreat behind his books. And his motto in life was all is chaos. And he had very little kind of emotional capacity to enable his family of 3 children to, as it were, feel secure. He was constantly really in flight from life. And he married this very extrovert, emotionally hysterical, I would say, a woman, red-headed woman from a remote part of Russia. And, well, it was a chaotic household. She called it a madhouse. And they had 3 very intelligent children. Etty was the first, born in 1914. Her brother Jap was born in 16, and her brilliant young brother Misha was born in 1920. He was a concert pianist, except that he never had the confidence to play unless his parents were watching him. So basically a picture of a very muddled up family that she came out of, and it showed in her behavior, quite honestly. She was very sexually promiscuous, she was confused, and you really wouldn't have heard much about her, except for a relationship she made. First of all, she went to Amsterdam she grew up in a little provincial town in the middle of Holland called Deventer. And then she moved to Amsterdam as a young woman to study law at Amsterdam University. She went on to study a second degree in Slavic languages at Leiden University. So she was highly intelligent, but emotionally chaotic. She had lots of boyfriends. She moved house, lots of flats. Kind of, in some ways, you could say she was quite a modern young young woman in search of her life and very confused about it all. And then she eventually landed up in a flat in South Amsterdam called Gabriel, in the street called Gabriel Metsustraat, with a kind man who was the landlord of an international community of young students. And he was 62, she was 27. They began an affair. But that wasn't the most important relationship. The most important relationship in this young woman's life was with a Jungian therapist who'd come from Berlin called Julius Speer. And he used to gather around him young people, often women, who were looking for help. And Etty found herself completely fascinated by this very insightful Jungian therapist, a man who had known Carl Jung himself and had been in analysis with Jung. And Etty formed a close relationship with him and went into analysis with him. And he encouraged her to keep a diary. And that's really where her story begins, the keeping of the diary, because her writing is whimsical, insightful. She could stand back and see the whole context of history, what was happening. And through her diary, she was exploring her own journey. And she began that journey as somebody who didn't have a religious background at all. She hadn't been brought up in the synagogue. There were no family Jewish rituals in her home. She certainly wasn't anything to do with the church. And Speer himself, of course, was a Jew also. So, but he was somebody who, as well as having considerable insight as a Jungian therapist, was also interested in religion, as of course was Carl Jung. And I'm cutting some corners here, I must not be too lengthy. He encouraged her to begin to look at her life in a deeper sense, and even to begin to meditate, to begin to find some stillness amongst the chaos. And her spiritual journey began through her relationship with him. And you could say a self emerged. I called the first chapter in my book an emerging self, because there wasn't very much there beforehand except a whole bundle of need and desire and confusion and longing and all the rest of it. But there wasn't much stability. And a kind of a sense of selfhood emerged. And then that went deeper as she learnt to pray and find a practice of prayer and meditation. He, though he was a Jew, he was also interested in Christianity, and he introduced her to the Gospel of Matthew, which she loved, as well as the letters of St. Augustine, as well as the letters of St. Paul, whom she always called the Jew Paul. I'm not sure he would have liked that very much. But anyway, and she also was terribly drawn to the poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke, and particularly Rilke's beautiful collection of early poems called the Book of Hours. They were very important to her. As well were the Russian novels. From her mother's side, she learnt Russian, she could speak Russian, and she loved Dostoevsky's novels, particularly The Idiot, Tolstoy's novels. So she had a wide intellectual embrace, but underneath it all was this searching longing for a spiritual identity.
Thank you for that introduction, Patrick. I'm thinking, of course, I appreciate in your case you chose to name your book A Life Transformed, though the title of what most people know about Etty Hillesum, her diaries, is A Life Interrupted, right? Which it's still true. I mean, I'm not saying that her life was not interrupted, but I will say the interruption is not the end of the story, right? Transformation is coming in the context of interruption. So you chose to name your book A Life Transformed, and you just glimpse at her transformation. And in regards to her transformation, if I'm not mistaken, you describe it in your book as almost volcanic, so to say, happening in a very short span of time, considering, as you say, her previous secular background and also emotionally up and down. So from your perspective, what made such a rapid inner revolution possible?
Well, I called it transformed. She herself wrote in July 1942, I knew that I would have to undergo many transformations. And so she had this sense of life as a process of growing. And I mean, it connects with your own thinking about evolution in divine love. This sense of moving into a deeper and deeper identity of, in the end, self-giving. The self that she began to find, in the end, she was able to lose and, if you like, give away. And in that sense, I see a kind of Christ-likeness about her, although she never mentions the name Jesus Christ, although she loves the Gospel of Matthew and loved the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. So, you asked about, it was almost explosive. I would say it was very rapid. And it happened under the pressure of the time she lived in, the pressure of the terror, really. I mean, we must remember that she was in Amsterdam in the early 1940s. Amsterdam had a very big Jewish population, and increasingly they became persecuted, and life began to become more and more impossible for them. And then Etty Hillesum begins to kind of carve out her particular spiritual identity, which was very, very practical and very earthed in the particular context of her time. I mean, particularly when hatred was, if you like, the common currency of the people, of the Jews of Amsterdam. I mean, they were on the receiving end of a terrible hatred, but in a reciprocal way, they began to hatred of the Germans and of the Nazis, who were dragging them off to concentration camps and terrorizing them, became a kind of common currency. Etty Hillesum, very early in her diaries, said, if we succumb to this hatred, it's the same kind of barbarism that we're on the receiving end, and it will destroy us as human beings. So she took a stand against hatred and refused to hate. And then growing in her was this, many people, because she was very intelligent, offered her hiding places, because as well as hatred, there was fear. And she took a stand against fear. And she said, I'm not going to hide, because I want to write about what's going on. And then as she heard about the transit camp called Westerbork, which is up on the German-Dutch border, Sam and I, when I was researching my book, visited it. Sam is my wife. And we went there, and she, instead of hiding, she had this, you could call it a vocation, really, to go, it was a vocation, to go and care for and serve and support the most needy. She herself was a single woman, and there were lots of families, people with small children, old people, in this transit camp. And she went there, and she joined the Jewish Council, which was an organization set up by the Nazis to look after Jewish affairs. And initially she was a secretary in Amsterdam, and then she hated that. And she became a social worker for people in transit. And she went to Westerbork voluntarily, as a social worker initially, to care for and support the most vulnerable. So it was, you talked about transformation. It was an extraordinary process of change from being somebody who was chaotic, muddled up, self-centered, needy, through her relationship with this therapist. She found her own life. She began to find a life of prayer. Increasingly, she had this sense of the divine inhabiting her and living in her and relating to the divine life. And that drove her, first of all, to take a stand against hatred, to refuse to hide, and then to go to the transit camp where she did two things, really. She served and cared for, and there's a lovely letter that I found that I came across, which actually wasn't in the original Letters and Diaries, which is a huge volume, which describes her ordinary days of caring in this camp. She talks about at one point holding Meister Eckhart's letters in one hand and scrubbing the toilets with the other. So, this was no kind of remote sort of nun-like figure. This was a woman whose feet were absolutely planted on the earth, giving very practical care to people. And the second part of her vocation was to write, to be the as she put it, the chronicler of our adventures. And she really could write a marvelous sense of description. And she wrote about the train that used to leave every Monday night, taking 1,000 half-starved, broken, damaged, terrified, traumatized people in cattle wagons to the death camps in Poland. And she writes and describes this train. And in my book, I've given some, as you will have read, some examples of her writing. So it was a process of transformation from self-centered chaos towards other-centered care and writing about bearing witness. But it was fast. I mean, most of us take a lifetime. Jürgen Moltmann famously said, the longest journey home is the inward one. The longest journey home to find oneself is the inward one. It can take a whole lifetime and perhaps more, he said.
Yeah, we in India will say with reincarnation or in our background, it may take a few lifetimes. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
So it was fast. It was under pressure of... I sometimes think of a kind of chemical reaction. If you put heat under chemists in a Bunsen burner, it reacts much faster. And it was under the heat of this persecution that she changed.
Like the example sometimes given of the diamond, that it can emerge in all its purity under intense heat and an intense pressure, and there will be some heating in between. I'm thinking of one quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I think is her name, that she says something like along the lines of people are like stained glass windows. So they sparkle and shine when the sun is out, but when the darkness sets in, their beauty is revealed only if there is a light from within.
Yes.
So I cannot avoid thinking about Etty Hillesum in this particular situation, as you say, that the transformation happened very rapidly.
Yes.
Also, being her, so to say, put to test, if you want to use that terminology, by certain circumstances and something unique emerging. And I'm thinking, I think your book suggests that Etty was not, in one sense, transformed despite the war, but somehow through all that the war brought. So in that connection, I don't know, I always like to think that perhaps the aim of life is not so much to eliminate suffering altogether, because some people may approach spirituality from a place of, I need relief, and it's totally understandable. But at one point you may reach a situation when you realize it's not about stopping to suffer, but learning to suffer, how to suffer well. Not that we want to suffer masochistically, but suffer will knock on our door nonetheless. So I don't know if, in your opinion, what does it mean in Etty's case to suffer well, or even in your own life journey, of course, right?
Yes. Well, she, one of the very earliest lessons that she writes about is the need to accept what was happening to them. Not to, as it were, indulge in hatred, which can be a form of avoiding the fear and the insecurity, but to accept And she wrote about acceptance of death. She wrote, we have to look our end, our destruction, straight in the eye. She talked about death as an old friend that kind of, it's extraordinary language, really, that creeps into my life, and I have accepted it now. I've accepted him now. And she also wrote about, we have to, instead of hating, and we have to accommodate our sorrow. We have to make a decent shelter for our sorrow. And that is the way that, as it were, we are fashioned as human beings, in order to learn how to accept the sometimes awful realities that life can deal out to people, to learn how to say yes to it, and to go on, not despite it, but even more fully because of it. And you could say that her life was enriched through her capacity to embrace her situation. She certainly would have seen it that way.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, you said it a moment ago, we mustn't avoid suffering. Well, it's actually not possible to really avoid it. I mean, life keeps dealing out, and goodness knows we're more than aware of that at the moment with what's going on in the world. Difficult situations, and the only path, and I see this as a Christian, I suppose, in the embracing of the cross of the cross of Jesus Christ. Really, it's as you embrace the reality of what's happening that your life you can be destroyed by suffering, you can be diminished by it, but you also can be deeply enriched by it.
Yeah. I'm thinking about what you just mentioned. Yesterday, I had a call with a friend. He's a rabbi, and we were talking about the current times we are living and how the zeitgeist we are in somehow calls us as a form of generational duty, almost, to develop this capacity to hold simultaneously both the beauty and the broken, so to say, right? Like, without losing sight of either, again, without becoming intoxicated by harmony to the point of losing sight of the horrors, but also not zooming into the horrors exclusively, because we literally go crazy, especially in the times we live, that there's so much access to information about what's going on everywhere that we can just be paralyzed because of that. So how to balance both beauty and brokenness, I think it's kind of a generational duty, just because of being born in this time of creation. It's like you need that tool to basically survive. And for me, I'm thinking about how in many ways, Etty Hillesum embodied this spirit of not embracing one at the cost of the other, but embracing sorrow, embracing pain and loss, and so much in ways that I'm reminded of a quote by Khalil Gibran. He will say, the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain, right? And I'm reminded of a word that still I remember when we went into the Wells Cathedral and you asked us when we were there, what's one word that comes to your mind in this moment? And I was a little shy and didn't say anything, some other shirt, but my word was spaciousness. And then you say the word spaciousness yourself, the word, and I'm relating the word spaciousness to what we are talking about here now. The spaciousness that we need to create in our inner heart to hold all this.
I do think that is very, very important. And it's increasingly a challenge in the digital era in which we live, where the bombardment of external stimuli and news and social media is like a kind of blizzard, and people can get caught up in it. And she would have said, because of course she lived, I mean, I often say she's quite a contemporary person, She came from a dysfunctional family. Her route into religion was through psychotherapy. She wasn't interested in institutional religion at all. She was deeply ecumenical in the widest sense, crossing the boundaries of religions. All those things make her a curiously contemporary person. But another way that she was not contemporary is that she lived in the early 1940s, before the time of, when you think about it, before the time of television, before the time of, well, certainly she wouldn't have understood anything like a mobile telephone. There would have been very
You just
simple.
say before the time of social media, because for some people they cannot even conceive there was no social media at some point, right?
Yeah, she was long before all that, which meant that she had time. She had time to read. She had time to think. She had time to reflect. She had time to accommodate the realities of the experience around her and what was happening around her into her own soul, and, if you like, to allow those things to work their way within her. And she would have emphasized how important that is, that we do, as it were, retreat and take on board what's going on and give ourselves space to accommodate the sorrow, to feel the delight and joy, to notice the created world, so it is a particular challenge, and I speak as somebody who has grandchildren who are teenagers, and therefore they're thoroughly digital natives, and it is extraordinary, this bombardment, creating this digital generation of anxious young people. So she would have talked a lot about the need for, there's two senses. You need to find space and places of retreat, as well as places of engagement. You talked earlier about a balance between beauty and brokenness. Well, there's also a balance between engagement with the realities of the world, with being involved in politics, being involved in business, being involved in discipleship, and retreat.
Zooming in and zooming out.
Absolutely crucial. So we have to withdraw into quiet spaces in order, and also, though, we need, you say when you first went into Wells Cathedral and gazed around at this vast, beautiful, proportioned space, that you felt a sense of spaciousness. For her, and I think for many writers on contemplative prayer, I'm sure you would agree, one of the great gifts of a sense of really learning to be still is to enter into your own inner spaciousness, or to discover a gift of inner spaciousness. Martin Laird, I don't know if you know the...
You talk about him. You yourself talked about him to me when we met.
Yeah. Well, sure. He is, I think, the writer who's, I'm just looking for my books on his, yes, here we are. I'm here in my little hut at the bottom of the garden. Not so little either. Anyway, his beautiful book, Into the Silent Land, here.
I have it there. I could also wake up and bring my own copy and show it to prove that I follow your advice and I got it. So thank you.
You got it?
Yeah.
And then the next one is called A Sunlit Absence. And the third one is called An Ocean of Light. 3 little books that he's a member of the community of St. Augustine in Villanova University. I think he's Canadian anyway, I'm not sure. But he writes about this wonderful sense of being, as it were, given a great sense of spaciousness. Spaciousness for yourselves, spaciousness for other people, so that you're able to welcome people into a sense of spaciousness.
Yeah.
And I feel you do that. That's a gift that you have.
I was just thinking that in order to do that, whether I'm doing that on some degree or not, but as you say, you have to have this, to cultivate this inner spaciousness so you can hold space for other people. Because if you
Yes.
don't have your own inner spaciousness,
Yes.
probably you will make other people feel suffocated in your company to some degree or another. So it's kind of a proportion there, right? As much as we have our own inner spaciousness, we can gift and hold that space in our relationships. But yeah, I totally agree with you, Patrick, that that's a must for the time we are living. And as you were saying, with all this, the rapid pace in which technology is unfolding. I was talking recently to a neuroscientist. He was telling me how there is, to use the word, evolutionary mismatch, where our technology has outpaced our biology. So we no longer had the capacity to process, basically, the amount of information that is coming to us. So our biology cannot keep up with that. So the need of spaciousness and the need of time and space to process the content. And I think Etty, as you say, as much as she's totally relatable, her background, her life background to the many people in this time and age, at the same time, what makes her different, as you just mentioned, in terms of her spaciousness, is such a necessary ingredient to survive these times. And I'm thinking something that also makes her very relevant, up-to-date, contemporary, relatable figure is what you just mentioned, her ecumenical nature. I mean, Etty drew from many traditions, as you say, without although born as a Jewish, she was not a Jewish practitioner. So in one sense, she was not officially affiliated to any given lineage. She was, she will portray for many what today is known as interspirituality. So, and I know that you have a deep interest in interfaith issues, and I'm, okay, again, for me, Etty Hillesum's life testimony is in itself a big contribution to interfaith dialogue. Again, great affinity toward Christianity, a great curious mind and heart, open to so many currents of inspiration, while remaining her own unique, fully individuated, speaking in Jungian terms, individuated person, right? So I don't know, I'm thinking in this connection, will you say that her notion of God, or her embrace of spirituality, challenges traditional religious frameworks, or maybe somehow fulfills them in a necessary way?
Yes. She. One of the questions I often wonder about, because I somehow felt very close to her as I wrote my book about her, was what would have happened had she survived the war. And it's not impossible to believe she could have survived the war. Even in her refusal to hide, she obviously became much more vulnerable, but there were people who did survive the war, and I don't mean survive Auschwitz, never have gone to Auschwitz. She could have stayed perhaps in Westerbork until the Allies in the end came. The last train went out in 1944. Anna Frank was on that last train from Westerbork. So it's not impossible that she could have survived the war. And what would have happened to her sense of spirituality when the conditions were changed so dramatically from terror and fear and persecution and imminent death towards the possibility of living an extended life? And I think, I mean, it's impossible. Nobody would know, nobody can tell, but I think she might have needed to find some kind of tradition to become rooted in, because one of the paradoxes of the contemplative life, as I'm sure you would agree is that, and Thomas Merton really, I think, really reveals this very much to me, is that being open to many traditions and remaining open and spacious and able to receive the wisdom of different traditions and understandings is nurtured, that sort of openness and spaciousness, because you're absolutely rooted in one tradition. I mean, his extraordinary, you will know from the Asian Journal,
I have it
that
there as well,
it was sitting in front of those massive Buddhas at Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka, where he had this sense of, there was, you know, I mean, I hesitate to say it really. He said, "I have seen beyond the shadow and the disguise."
Yeah, deep epiphany there,
And I don't know what else is more for me now. I was going to say he'd arrived, but that would be to diminish it. But it was an absolute high point of his spiritual journey. 4 days later, he was dead. So in every sense, it was a kind of real end point for him. But here was a contemplative Cistercian monk, spent his whole life in the discipline of the Christian monastic life, receiving this in front of Buddhist statues. I mean, it was wonderful, wonderful. But I think that kind of openness only comes through your own deep-rootedness. I think Etty might have become an Orthodox because she loved Russian, but who knows?
Well, I was thinking, I of course, we cannot tell in which tradition she will have been affiliated, but what I will say is whatever will have been the tradition, she would have become a very, not only committed member, but I will say a deep mystic, as she already, I will dare to say that by the end of her life, she was in many ways sharing glimpses of a mystical life and mystical experiences in so many ways. So that could have only continued.
And that mysticism was deeply rooted within her. I mean, her understanding of the divine. I mean, as you know,
let's go there, Patrick, because she says some very interesting things about God. For example, God being the deepest part of oneself. I don't know if you have any thoughts in connection to that one line, for example.
She said, "God is what is deepest and best in me."
Thank you for the literal.
And later she refined that to say, "God is what is deepest and most essential in me." And she said, at one point she said, "Truly my life is one long hearkening." That's an important word. She used a German word, Hineinhörchen. Truly my life is one long hearkening, by which she meant a deep capacity to listen within, to kind of attend to some hidden inner depth. Truly my life is one long hearkening unto myself, unto others, unto God. And she went on, if I say that I hearken, it's not really me that hearkens. It is God who hearkens within me, the deepest and best in me, hearkening unto the deepest and most essential in the other, God to God. So
sounds like a mystic to me.
that is the sense of her faith. And I think that's a very wonderful way to talk about God. God is what is deepest and best in me. And, you know, I'm so conscious that often we live out of what is shallow and what is, what is manipulative, what is game playing, what is
more shadowy.
shadowy within me. I don't live out of what is deepest and most essential in me. Most essential when all the trivia has been cut away. So even that title speaks of a journey into depth and into the deepest part of herself.
Patrick, I'm thinking something else that Etty Hillesum said, and you correct me if I'm misquoting, in connection to God. She will say something like, of course, in the context of the concentration camps and the situation in war, God cannot help us. We must help him. We must protect his dwelling place inside us. So I'm curious how you understand that powerful statement today, and also how do you personally understand, or you feel Etty understood the situation of God? Like sometimes you hear this idea of God being omnipotent, all this main omnis, and in a situation that journalists most often quoted to disprove God's existence, right? The Holocaust. Okay, if God exists and he's all powerful and all good, how he allowed this to happen? We are going into a theodicy department here. But I don't know, that came now regarding this line from Etty about God cannot help us, which doesn't sound like an omnipotent God, and I wouldn't have a problem entertaining that possibility. We must help him, we must protect his dwelling place inside us.
Yes, it came in one of her dialogues of prayer. She said, God, you can't help us. And this obviously came out of the experience of having seen too many people dragged off to concentration camps, too many people, desperate men, too many traumatized women. She said, you can't help us. It also came out of the context of many people saying, this is going to end, the English are going to land, the British will come. She said, no, you're deluding yourselves. So in a situation of breakdown and trauma and fear and terror, she said, you cannot help us, but we must help you. And as you said, and we must defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. And she went on to say, there are some people who are putting their silver forks and spoons into safekeeping instead of guarding you, dear God. And I think what she meant by this is that unless she held on to this sense of the divine image and likeness within herself, the divine beauty, the sense of kindness and the capacity to love and care and give and listen to other people, the sense of a centered person, unless she held on to her own center, her own what was deepest and best in her, she would be destroyed. She'd become inhuman. She would become barbaric herself. She would start hating. She would fight over scraps of food. She would attack other people. She would become she'd become kind of destroyed. So God was what enabled her to retain her humanity. God was the name of her humanity. He was what was deepest and best in her. So she had to look after this God. And it's a beautifully feminine, almost, many would say, kind of a bit like the Virgin Mary, holding inside her this God that is what is deepest and best, and enables her life to go on being beautiful. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I was thinking, you mentioned that was deeply feminine, and again, for me, I was reflecting these days how, as I was thinking about our conversation, how Etty Hillesum's life embody what we might call, in many ways, the feminine dimension of spiritual path. And again, not necessarily in a gendered sense, but in qualities like receptivity, vulnerability, spaciousness, relational depth, and an immense capacity to hold paradox. Like the feminine has a lot to do with paradox and holding space for that without hardening, as you say, without becoming resentful. So for me, she's a very kind of sacred symbol of feminine presence, sacred feminine, that I think is very necessary in the times we are living as well, where we have too much toxic masculinity and too much so-called strength, which actually we know behind that so-called strength, there's so much fear, so much unintegrated
so much
dimensions.
weakness. Yes.
We will, in a world that overvalues control and efficiency and domination, I think a figure like her is so important in terms of divine feminine. And I really appreciated what you say also, Patrick, in terms of how she needed to reach that place to survive the whole situation, not only survive physically, but survive internally, the horrors that were happening. I'm thinking about another, of course, famous author in connection to the Holocaust, Viktor Frankl, who famously declared as the foundation of what will become eventually his logotherapy, like, this is the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, right? So it's pretty clear for me that Etty Hillesum fully chose her own way, even to the last breath, basically.
She chose her own way. And as well as all these, as you call it, feminine characteristics, one thing I think that characterized her life was immense, actually, erotic energy. Now, the eros, the eroticism, when she was a young woman and going into therapy, was leading her astray. And what she learned to do was to channel, redirect that erotic energy towards discovering her own deeper life, and I would say the divine life. And this erotic energy was shown in her absolute no-nonsense discipline and determination that she would deal with her own chaos. I mean, I think a lot of other people, and I'm sure I would have been the same, would have sort of given up in despair along the way. She wouldn't do that. I mean, and this made her, I mean, she would have been quite a difficult person to live with because she would have been very intense. She was utterly determined. She has this, what I think in the Hindu tradition is called sometimes one-pointedness.
Yeah, ekagrahatva, I'm thinking. Yeah, I was thinking about that, exactly that term in my mind.
Absolute one-pointed determination to deal with her own muddle and her own chaos, and to go deeper into love of God and to love of other people, and to live from what was deepest and best in her. So she gets very cross with herself sometimes, and when she writes, because she's tired of her messing around and not focusing more. I mean, which makes her so lovable, really, because she's so human.
I think that's what makes her so relatable also. Of course, maybe her one-pointedness, some of us may not fully relate to that in the sense that not everyone is as intense as she may be, as committed, but her humanity and the way she dialogues with herself. And I appreciate the point that you mentioned, how she's like redeeming her eroticism, so to say. The word eros is not a bad word. And we are so afraid, actually, again, that's for me a very important point in nowadays. People need to know what to do with their erotic energy, so to say, because when it's not properly expressed, it's just creating trauma after trauma. And the other day I was thinking about the word eros in connection to intimacy, and then the word intimacy in connection to intimidation, and how many times the word intimidation has to do with what happens when we are faced with intimacy. Most of us generally are terrified, and she was really vulnerable and brave and courageous
Oh,
in embracing her erotic dimension with intimacy, even in connection to the divine. And I'm thinking in this connection, one of the most striking, maybe the line that most stuck after finishing your book, among many, to be honest, but one of the most, of course, striking elements was her rediscovery of prayer, especially kneeling. And this one line that came was, sure, she's saying like basically something like, this act of kneeling in prayer is even more intimate than sex, right?
Yes.
So I don't know if you would like to share some reflections about this embodied gesture of kneeling. I think it was at her bathroom in one particular carp that she had. How and why this became so central for her and what we can learn from that.
Yes. Well, indeed, it was in her stages into ever more greater intimacy with the divine, this practice of kneeling down, and there are about a dozen references to it in the diaries. She at first she can't understand it. She says it's not a habit that's given to us Jews to kneel. But she says, as you just mentioned, she's almost embarrassed about it at first. And she says, and she knew about sex, she had many relationships with men, but she discovers this act of intimacy with herself and with the divine life is, as she says, it's more intimate than sex. And then her mind kicks in. She says, I feel embarrassed about this because it conflicts with my rational atheistic self. And there's part of her that's saying, what on earth are you doing? Kneeling down on the coconut matting in the untidy bathroom, and finding a deep sense of silence and adoration, I would say, of the other, a sense of the other. You know, in the Hebrew religion, the word holy, kodesh, also can mean other. It's so this sense of the other. She kneels, and she finds herself kneeling in the untidy bathroom, and part of her brain is saying, "What on earth is going on? You know, this is the rational atheistic bit of her, as she says." But there's a much deeper part of her, because she was very conscious, and Jung perhaps had helped to understand this, of the difference between her thinking mind and her more intuitive, deeper levels of herself. And she writes about these two levels of consciousness. And she was going into this deeper level of consciousness, of stillness, of silence, and discovering there a ground of life. As Paul Tillich would say, the great American theologian, the ground of her being, where she learnt to rest and find a great spaciousness. And she would find that as she would be going around the flat in her doing, because she was a cleaner in this flat. She was the housekeeper, and she would feel a deep need to suddenly to kneel down and be still. So it was like something, and she said it came from outside her. So it was like her life was being taken hold of by some kind of a divine embrace, and she didn't resist it. But she also said, what on earth's going on? This is crazy. So I love this kind of sense of her wrestling with different aspects of herself. The rational mind of a young woman in a post-Enlightenment university who, had a very lively thinking mind. The deeper level of herself, she embraced her sense of intimacy. It all became integrated, And I think she therefore became, and she was therefore able to deal with the fear. I mean, I think it's important to say to people who are listening to this woman didn't, it wasn't all smooth sailing. When she was in the camp, sometimes she would fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it would overwhelm her. But broadly speaking, there was a deeply integrated self emerged who was able to go on the train with an enormous sense of sort of acceptance and love of other people and grace and kindness. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll get in a minute to which was the very last thing she wrote when going to the last train we know about. But before that, in speaking about the integration she had, despite, as you say, acknowledging her humanness and her breaking apart at times, which is, I think, it's an important reminder, so we do not over-idealize, and by over-idealizing someone, we dehumanize the person at the end of the day. And she was so human, as you just described, in so many beautiful, necessary ways. But for me, one of the aspects of her, and you just mentioned that before, the aspects of her integration, her inner spaciousness, her deep prayer life came in the form of, as a fruit, in the form of her refusal to hate, even in the face of the horrors of Nazism. And for me, that's perhaps one of also her most radical stances that I can recall. And if I'm not mistaken, she says something to the effect of, like, even the worst crimes, I try to look them in the eye and
see
find a small naked human being beneath
human
the
being
wreckage.
amid the monstrous wreckage of our senseless deeds. And I think that very Hebrew insight in the Jewish tradition, I suppose the most fundamental belief is that all human beings carry within us the image of God.
Yeah.
However buried and defaced and abandoned that image is.
Yeah. I couldn't avoid thinking, and I don't know how much aware she may have been of, but of Jesus' words on the cross, that Father, forgive them, they know not what they are doing. Yeah. And in our tradition, we'll be very tied to the notion in Sanskrit of avidya, which means basically ignorance, not knowing. So like when you look right in the eye of the horrors and the tragedy and the betrayal, there is some ignorance behind that, some fragility, some brokenness, some fragmented, fractured self that elicits compassion and understanding rather than condemnation. So I don't know. Mind it sounds like a bodhisattva level of compassion, but yeah, I can see how she was.
And she embraced the paradox. She said once to her old friend Klaus Smelik, she said, Klaus, and this is a difficult thing to say, she said, no one is really bad deep down. Now, but she also said that people who, if you like, believe in their own masks and live out of their own masks can be very dangerous. So she wasn't blind to the nature of evil and how people who live from not their own depths but from their masks and their games and their postures and the personas that they put on or they learn are extremely dangerous. And we are seeing that in the world today. There's some very dangerous people running our world. But so she would both hold to this fundamental Jewish belief, but also recognize, don't be starry-eyed about this. Human beings can be very dangerous.
Yeah, not the extreme of naivete, not the extreme of cynicism, but
that's
properly balanced hope, basically.
That is beautifully put.
Yeah,
a balance between naivety and cynicism. Yes,
and again, I think that's a powerful message to most of us in the times we are living, because it's so easy to go to one extreme or the other, right?
Well, I think it's very easy to get cynical.
Yeah. And it's also very sobering for us to know, okay, I may not be that particular person that is creating world chaos, but in potential, I am that person. if I just choose to, as you say, to over-identify with my masks and defend them until the last breath, I can become a threat to the universe, basically.
Yes.
So it's sobering and humbling to know I could go there in potential, though my brightest potential calls me in another direction, right?
Why we need constantly to say, Lord, well, in our tradition, Kyrie eleison, God have mercy upon us, because every one of us is capable of that kind of, out of our muddle-upness behaving, rather than out of what is deepest and best in us.
Yeah.
Which most of us, maybe one doesn't even know it.
Yeah. And
I
that's
mean,
another
part of
conversation, but even when we may be confronted with our brightest potential, we may be also terrified about that, because we may not even believe it, or we may be scared about all that good that we can be because it's something unknown to us, so we may be terrified about the unknown. So many possibilities.
And the journey, and she would say the journey home is to find, I'm thinking of that, my favorite parable of Jesus of Nazareth is the story of the prodigal, because it's a story of your journey home from your own muddle and chaos to your true self. And to be embraced by the grace of the Father in it all. And that's our journey to discover our truest and deepest self. And most of us don't even yet know that.
Yeah. And speaking about journey, Patrick, and even journey home, as we know, Etty Hillesum's last known words come from a postcard that she threw from the train, according to what we know, on the way to Auschwitz. There were words that were later found and delivered, where she writes, "We left the camp singing." Right? So for me, it sounds like a journey home, though one will say, what are you talking about? That's a journey to the death, but the way she was embracing the journey, it's for me a confirmation. She's going home no matter where she's externally. So, but anyhow, we left the camp singing. Probably my main, or at least first question there is, what kind of inner life makes it possible to say we left the camp singing on the way to Auschwitz, right?
Yeah. And there's another quotation that where she writes about, I'll come back to that in a moment, but there's another quotation which is equally powerful, where she talks about the misery being terrible in the camp. People are living, as she puts it, like so many rats in a sewer. But then she says, but sometimes late at night, I walk along the barbed wire, and it soars straight from my heart. I can't help it. The feeling that life is glorious and magnificent, and that one day we will be building a whole new world. So again, this paradox of being in a barbed wire holding transit camp on the way to Auschwitz, she's able to have this sense of life is beautiful and glorious and magnificent. And it soars from deep inside her. And I think, she couldn't ever silence the kind of undersong of joy, of the ground of being itself, which was in her. And that, she sat on her rucksack in the middle of this cattle wagon on her last journey, with 70 other people. Pretty hellish, really. And you're right, she writes this card to her friend Christine Van Newton. And she says, opening the Bible at random, I find this: the Lord is my high tower. I am sitting on my rucksack in the middle of a full freight car. Father, mother, and Misha are a few cars away. In the end, the departure came without warning, on sudden special orders from The Hague. We left the camp singing. Father and mother firmly and calmly, Misha too. So they all sang. And I suspect it was them returning, I don't know what they sang, some Jewish song thumbs. They were, as it were, connecting with the depths of their tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And for her, it would have been connecting with something that was deeper than all this hell and misery and fear breaking out all around her.
Yeah.
Whether she was able to sustain that through a long time at Auschwitz, she didn't die until the 30th of November, God knows.
Mm.
It is, one would like to hope she could, but it would have been tested to its uttermost.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, my own experience of what I felt when I read that line was, okay, for that you can sing in that, even in that situation, as you say, without knowing what happened after and the context, but to feel like there's reasons to sing is like to testify, like, okay, suffering exists undeniably, but somehow it's there to testify that love is greater still, right?
Yes, and what she was doing was guarding this God within her,
Mm-hmm.
who kept breaking out into song, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, and it feels like a form of praise. And when I say praise, I don't mean just like, thank you, God. Also, gratitude, but also a praise that includes everything, includes, as you say, paradox, suffering, uncertainty, impending death, all-inclusive praise. That's how it felt for me, this beautiful line. Patrick, you also, of course, apart from writing the book on Etty, you wrote a few other books, at least one more that I know, but I know there are a few more. And you gifted that to me, Lives in the Psalms.
Oh, right.
You're with me. Just saying, you don't believe me is your dedication here.
Yes.
So, but you published Etty Hillesum's book on 2009, if I'm not mistaken, and then a few years later you published this one, Life in the Psalms, in 2015. So where you render these ancient prayers for a contemporary audience. So I'm curious, looking back, since you wrote the book on Etty first, then the other one, what kind of connection you see between these two projects? Like in particular, how did your deep immersion in the life of Etty Hillesum in her world shaped or prepared the way you approached the Psalms, where many of the prayers of the Psalms entail rawness, grieving, the type of praise that I just referred to, which are all elements very present in Etty Hillesum's life, right?
Yes, indeed. And the Psalms were terribly important to her. She would say the Psalms every day.
Mm.
And actually, I felt towards the end, although she fell in love with the Gospel of Matthew and loved the letters of St. Augustine, I think in a faint, strange way, she became more Jewish towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Psalms are the book. The Jews call them the Book of Praises. They are the absolute undersong of the whole Jewish tradition, and this was important for her. For me, well, I wrote the book Etty Hillesum when I was at the cathedral. I used to work at the cathedral here as one of the canons. And then I retired, and I suppose I needed to think about how I continue my own practice, because we bought a little house down in the countryside, and I had a little hut at the bottom of the garden, not this great big hut that you saw when you came here.
Okay.
A small hut, and I used to go every morning and evening to my hut, because I didn't anymore have the discipline of a tradition where the priests would all meet to say prayers morning and evening. If you like, I had to sort of work it out on my own. And increasingly, actually, that was a great gift, in the sense that I didn't have to go through all these rather wordy prayers that us Anglicans are supposed to be saying if we're priests every day, to say all the whole of morning prayer, to say the whole of evening prayer. and that I had done for many, many, many years in the various churches and latterly the cathedral where I had served. So I had to work it out for myself. And I found that the more the fewer prayers I said, in a way, the more enriching the time went that I would set aside. And it was an opportunity to begin to learn more deeply what it means to sit still. And but if you're going to sit still, and if you're going to practice any kind of discipline of stillness and silence, then you do need a mental focus. At least I do anyway. I mean,
Not only you, no problem. You are not alone.
More than just the Buddhist practice of attention to the breath. In a kind of Hindu tradition, one needed what I think is sometimes called a mantra or a word. For the Christians, often it's the saying of the Jesus prayer, and that is very important for me. But also the Psalms. So instead of saying lots of canticles and prayers and collects and have readings from the Bible, I would often just take a psalm. And even not just a psalm, but just one line from a psalm.
Like Lectio Divina or something like that.
Yeah. Just one line from a psalm and repeat it in line with the breath. And I find that, and out of that practice, I wanted to encourage other people to pray using the Psalms, because they've been such a resource for me. They differ hugely, because some of them, as you rightly say, are actually really quite violent and painful, and they're howls of rage and howls of pain and resentment against God. And mind you, that's important, because that's all part of our experience. And then there's occasions of great joy and thanksgiving and praise. So they're a great mixed bag. But I wanted to focus on the Psalms, where there's a bit of a journey into the mystery of the divine life. Like Psalm 84, which is, how lovely are your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul has a desire and longing to enter the courts of the Lord. It's a wonderful journey into thanksgiving and praise. Or Psalm 63 is the great contemplative psalm. O God, you are my God, eagerly I seek you. Just take that one phrase as your prayer word for the morning. So I wanted to sort of unpack and it's just 30 psalms in that book, about how people can pray them. That was my emphasis, really.
Yeah, but I cannot, knowing you and knowing your book on Etty Hillesum and knowing the Psalms to some degree, I cannot avoid seeing all of them somehow together, all integrated in a beautiful way. Yeah, I'm curious, are you planning to write something more new next in connection to some of the things you've been writing the last years?
Well, I sometimes think about it, and I've been thinking about this last weekend. I did a workshop on forging a spirituality of hope, particularly drawing on the insights from Etty Hillesum's life, but trying to reposition them in the times that we now live, when so many people feel bereft of hope, in the face of the multiple overwhelmings that our time faces, particularly climate breakdown, loss of biodiversity, the assault of social media. Those things particularly perhaps are ones that make people, and the rise of anxiety, and now, of course, the breakdown of the international order and violence and so on and so forth, a world unraveling, collapsing around us. How can you find and forge because I do think it's a work to frame a spirituality which has this sense of hope and in it.
Yeah.
But I find myself distracted by some of the books I'm reading. I've just been reading your book this week, and then before that...
Sorry for my book being an obstacle into you writing your own book. That was not the intention when I gifted it to you.
Distraction is probably the wrong word, but it was a beautiful, beautiful kind of evocation of the nature of the way, God is constantly moving us on, and he is actually the very essence of something that is moving us, and that is not static and fixed, that we have to defend. There's so much religious conflict in the world is because people are defending traditions and practices that they feel are threatened by the outside, instead of moving beyond those fixed positions, which is very much Etty Hillesum's journey, and embracing new positions and new understandings and new developments. And Jesus of Nazareth himself, of course, was somebody who enormously was about the evolving love of God.
And it had a price, as we could see, to pay for that. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I say to you, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, love your enemies. That's a quantum leap forward.
Yeah. Like Mahatma Gandhi will say, if we just keep an eye for an eye, we all end up being blind.
We'll all be blind.
Tooth, we end up being toothless. So let's move
forward. But Jesus
forward.
said, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you.
Yeah. I remember Krishna saying in the Bhagavad Gita, your mind out of control is your worst enemy. Your mind under control is your best friend. So most of us will say, oh, now then my mind is my worst enemy. So the invitation is turn your worst enemy into your best friend.
That's wonderful.
Until your mind is not your best friend, you will be seeing worst enemies all around you, but it's just a projection from your own worst enemy, which is your uncontrolled mind. So, yeah. And as you say, Patrick, right? Like
one of the things that you really, a little example you've just given us there of how we need to learn from each other's traditions instead of, in any sense, try and compete or set them against each other. To learn from each other, the great feast of, I think...
Jesus depicted heaven like that, right? Like a very abundant banquet.
Yes, and every course is a different religion, really.
Yeah.
And we can all learn from... Etty Hillesum would have perfectly understood this.
Totally. And again, that's so relevant for the tension.
But the paradox is, as we said earlier, that curiously, it's quite hard to get to that sense of freedom until you've really deeply lived from within your own tradition.
I agree. I agree. Not wanting to say that I'm deeply anchored in my tradition and that's why I can be benefited by others, but on some degree that has been the experience. To the degree I've been able to be rooted in my tradition, I will say to that same degree I've been able to be nourished by sister traditions. Yeah. Patrick, before we put our conversation to rest, I'd like to end, as we came to a close, I'd like to try something delicate probably, and please feel free to nuance or even resist it. But given your deep immersion in Etty Hillesum's life, and even seeing that you many times during our conversation referred to, she will have said this now, she will probably have thought like this in a natural way. So I'd like to invite you not to speak for her like some type of medium type, but to intuitively echo what she might say today based on what you've come to understand of her voice. So if you are all right with this, maybe we can conclude with a few short 10 questions that I have in mind. And perhaps you can respond as you feel Etty Hillesum might have done, with just a few words, not necessarily elaborate answers. I don't know if you agree with my social experiment here.
Okay, that's...
Thank you. So first one will be, if Etty were alive today, what do you think she will be most concerned about in our current world?
Oh, I think she would be concerned about the amount of hatred. The amount of hatred, the rage. It seems to me, I mean, that's particularly a terrible thing that's happening in America. The amount of division and hatred, really.
Yeah.
And so I think that would be her main thing she would be concerned about.
Thank you. The second one is slightly similar, though feel free to say something different. You can say the same, but what will she say is the greatest danger of our time?
Well, she lived before our awareness of climate breakdown. But she was somebody who, within the very limited possibilities for her, loved the natural world and received a great sense of comfort, and beauty mattered to her. The beauty of the natural world. So I mean, it's hard to say this really, because we are now so aware of the extent of the climate breaking down and the loss of biodiversity, but it seems to me that she would have, and I mean, maybe I'm speaking more for myself, that seems to me the greatest danger that we face.
Okay, and what will she see, again, in your thought, the greatest hope in contrast to the greatest danger of our time?
Oh. That human beings are beautiful. That human beings, there's, when we can live not from our masks, but from deeper levels within ourselves, in the ordinary circumstances of life, people are just beautiful and lovely and lovable.
Yeah.
And she would have seen the loveliness in people and loved people. And I think the greatest hope is that this undercurrent of a sense of the loveliness of people, she would, I think, say, created in the image of God, is the greatest hope. And in the end, that loveliness will have the last word. I think she would say that.
How will she challenge our understanding of freedom today?
Oh, I think she might have said that freedom is not just doing what doing what your desires want you to do, because she knew the disasters of just following the surface, the desires, the impulses, the appetite, just living out of kind of superficial appetites, really, endlessly stimulated by a kind of, I mean, again, she didn't live in a world of mass advertising that you and I have grown up in. And I think, so the idea that freedom is just doing what you want and getting what you want and spending what you want is a complete illusion. I mean, freedom is when you're free of the impulses that drive you on to make genuine choices about what is good and beautiful and will promote the greatest happiness for yourself and others. So I think the way we talk about freedom is illusory a lot of the time.
I agree.
And she knew that. She really did know that.
Patrick, how might Etty speak about the body today, not as escape, but as a place of encounter?
Sorry, just occasionally the internet plays funny tricks on us, and I didn't hear that one.
Yeah. How
No,
might
it's come back.
yeah?
Say it.
How might Etty Hillesum speak about the body today, not as escape, but as a place of encounter?
The body.
Yeah, because sometimes we have a lot of disembodied spirituality, right? And I think her example is very much an embodied one.
Yeah. Definitely. Deeply embodied. And I mean, thank you. She, well, I think a woman like this, it would be absolutely impossible for her to escape her body into any sense of disembodiedness. She was, I mean, you can just tell from looking at the photographs which do survive of her. She's a very embodied sort of person. There's nothing and the way she writes, she describes, as well as loving, she had the gift of sight. She could see, and she describes. There's a very vivid description of one of the Jewish guards who, because the Nazis would use members of the Jewish council to, as it were, discipline and frighten and guard other in the camp, other Jews. And she describes this Jewish guard as a man with a very thick neck, and she describes his face and his. She says he has a look of. She describes the unhappiness in his face and in his eyes. So she had this very deep sense of who we are is lived out of our bodies, out of our expressions, out of our gestures, out of our the way we walk, the way we move. Everything. We are embodied creatures. We can't escape it, and nor should we want to. And so the fact that she moved away from her earlier erotic chaos didn't mean in any sense that she didn't live out of her body. And indeed, the way she began to pray was through this business of kneeling down in this, and she describes the untidy bathroom. It's very physical.
Yeah. Since you mentioned prayer, the next question that I had in mind, we have a few more minutes, Patrick, is what will she say about prayer in our time?
I'm sorry, you got
What will she say about prayer in our time?
Oh, yes, that's a very good question. And that's a difficult question. But towards the end, she said at one point, "My life is one long dialogue with you, O God." And then she writes a letter to her dear friend Henny Tidderman at the end, and the letter turns into a prayer, really. And she says, in the end, it comes back to just one word, which is God. And I think because she was in love with this divine life, she does talk to it. She does give thanks. I say it. It's, how do you put a pronoun on this divine mystery? But so she did pray. She did give thanks. But she didn't sort of, I think the problem of what we sometimes call in the Christian tradition intercessory prayer would have been a bit problematical for her, because she just longed for people to realize their own beauty and their own loveliness, and to live from that, what was deepest and best in them. That was her prayer, really.
Thank you. Patrick, a few more questions. What will Etty say to those who feel they have lost their faith?
I'm not sure. I think she'd just want to hug them, really.
Let's be practical and concrete. Yeah.
I think she would embrace them, hold their hands, look into their eyes. She might even say, well, you might have lost your faith, but you are, the divine hasn't lost faith in you.
Yeah, that's a very embodied answer you just gave, so thank you for that. And on a similar note, what will Etty say to those who feel overwhelmed by the state of the world nowadays? To each of us, basically.
She would have known that herself. Sometimes she wrote, everything just doesn't make sense to me anymore. She felt overwhelmed. It did come, those sense of nothing made sense anymore. But part of her was her no-nonsense, get up off the floor. She fainted at one point in the middle of the camp, probably from lack of food or inadequate food. But she would... So there was a deep sense of driving discipline that kept her caring and giving, and she would love poetry, and she would read Rilke again and again. And she had friends, and they would read Rilke's poetry together, and laugh together, and she'd also find places, of solitude and silence, insofar as that was possible in a terribly overcrowded, muddy transit camp of thousands of people. So I think but how would she find people how would she deal with people overwhelmed?
Again, maybe a good embrace and a good reminder that there have been loved and not forgotten. Yeah.
I think, she would have... She was a very physical person. She probably would have wanted to embrace them and be there, because I think people feel overwhelmed by the condition of the world when their own relationships are fraying very badly, perhaps, particularly. We all feel struggling with it.
Yeah.
But if we can nurture our own close relationships, and if we can also nurture our own inner spaciousness, then we can go on living, hopefully, believing in the lovableness of human beings.
Patrick, 2 more questions and I set you free, please. The 9th one will be, how might Etty explain today what she meant by helping God? What will that mean to her today?
Oh.
And I know that's a big question.
Well, we need to help you, and we need to guard your dwelling place inside us to the last. So she would have said, what does it mean to guard the dwelling place of God inside us? It means to retreat to places where, to some extent, you can create a sanctuary. She talked a sanctuary for your own soul. And sometimes she writes at one point about bending right down, and says, sometimes I will remain in this kneeling posture I feel like for days on end. And she describes her back, her body, her back, like a kind of wall, a protective wall, within which this flame can be nurtured. So to guard the dwelling place of the divine life inside us to the last is to nurture this inner spaciousness, this inner ground, this inner loveliness, this inner... And then the second way is by cutting away all that is inessential, because she did move from she said, you help God to be... a bit like Thomas Merton, she'd say, we don't have to get into the presence of God. God is constantly with us.
Yes, I like to say he's omnipresent, and sometimes we are omni-absent.
We're omni-absent, the beautiful. And we have to realize the presence. That's what she's talking about.
Okay,
you guard the dwelling place inside you. You strip away what is inessential as you look for what is deepest and most essential within you.
Amen. And finally, Patrick, what is the one message that Etty Hillesum will want us to remember?
Mm. Well, I would say something along the lines of the words of Julian of Norwich, that all in the end shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And that, however, because she ultimately believed in a ground of life that was greater than all our lives and greater than all the hell and the misery and the suffering that we inflict upon one another. And insofar as she believed that that was the ground and that was the ultimate, then, and you know, I suppose I use Christian language of St. Paul, that nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. I think she would say her life speaks of something like that.
In your own words, Patrick, something else you would like to share with us to feel complete in this conversation before we put it to rest?
Well, I'd like to say thank you, Swami, and I'd like to say thank you to you. I hope the internet is going. No, it's all right. It's come back.
Okay.
You have a remarkable capacity to listen to people, and you read this book. I don't know how many times you read it. I suspect you only read it once. My book.
Only once so far. But we won't be.
Well,
When I finished, the first thing I felt was, this is not the first time. This is not the only time I will be reading this book.
Well, my dear brother, I was genuinely surprised at how, at one reading, you had identified all the key themes and remembered some of the key sayings, and you'd managed to you really got her. And I want to thank you for that, because what it says to me is that you're somebody who has a deep capacity for attention. And Simone Weil used to say that prayer is really, in the end, just paying attention. And I suspect that must come out of a deep silence and a deep spaciousness and a deep undistracted center within you. And I think your capacity to hear and attend to this book, but your capacity to attend to and to be interested in other people is a huge gift. And I bless you for that. And thank you. And thank you for the privilege of sharing time with you and having this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for your blessings upon me. Thank you for reminding me of the gifts that I've received. They are not my own merit. They are gifts to whatever extent they are. And thank you for being a gift to yourself, to me and to the world.
You are honing your gift.
With the help of people like you, dear brothers like you. So thanks so much, Patrick. And it has been a blessing to be with you, to sit with you at the table today.
Yes. Thank you very much, Swami. Bless you.